The lobster traps were still in the bed of his truck. September 23, 2009, just after sunrise. The Ford F-150 sat exactly where David Kelly had parked it the night before, at the edge of the public boat launch in Prospect Harbor, Maine. The driver's door hung open, keys still in the ignition, interior light long since drained the battery dead. A coffee cup from the harbor store sat in the cup holder, half full, cold, film of cream settled on top. Marcus Webb had been launching his boat here for 30 years. He knew every vehicle, every fisherman, every routine. David's truck in that spot, at that angle, with the door open. Wrong. All wrong. The traps should have been in the water by now. David should have been 3 miles out, working his lines, radio crackling with the morning chatter of the fleet. Marcus approached slowly, calling out, "Dave, you in there, buddy?" His voice carried across the empty parking lot, bounced off the weathered buildings, disappeared into the morning fog rolling off the Atlantic. No answer, just the sound of waves against the rocky shore and the cry of gulls overhead. The cab was empty. David's yellow slicker lay crumpled on the passenger seat. His thermos, the beaten steel one his daughter had given him last Christmas, rolled on the floor. Marcus noticed the blood then. Not much, just a smear on the steering wheel. Another drop on the seat. Could have been from anything. Fishermen bled all the time. Hooks, lines, bait knives. But something made Marcus's stomach tighten. He walked to the dock, boots echoing on the wet planks. David's boat, the Mary Catherine, named after his late wife, bobbed at her mooring 50 yards out. She hadn't moved since yesterday. Her deck was empty, equipment secured, exactly as David would have left her after the previous day's haul. If David had gone out that morning, he would have taken the skiff tied to the dock. But the skiff was still there, oars shipped, rope coiled neat as always. Marcus pulled out his cell phone, surprised his hands were shaking. He'd known David Kelly for 20 years. They'd fished the same waters, weathered the same storms, buried too many mutual friends claimed by the sea. David was careful, methodical, the kind of fisherman who checked the weather 3 times before launching, who maintained his equipment religiously, who never took unnecessary risks. Hancock County Sheriff's Office, what's your emergency? Marcus stared at the empty truck, the abandoned boat, the vast gray ocean beyond. This is Marcus Webb down at Prospect Harbor. David Kelly's truck is here, but David's gone. Something's not right. Within an hour, the quiet boat launch transformed into a crime scene. Sheriff's deputies, Marine Patrol, eventually state police. Yellow tape fluttered in the salt wind. Radios crackled with codes and coordinates. The fishing community gathered at the edges, weathered faces grim, speaking in low voices about currents and tides, about who'd seen David last, about whether a man could fall off the dock in the dark and get swept out to sea. But David Kelly hadn't fallen. He hadn't drowned. As investigators would piece together over the coming days, David had met someone at that boat launch on the night of September 22nd. Someone he knew. Someone he trusted enough to meet after dark. Someone who killed him. His body would wash ashore 17 days later, 30 miles down the coast, tangled in kelp off Schoodic Point. By then, the investigation had already stalled. No witnesses, limited physical evidence, a victim whose routine was so predictable that any deviation stood out like a beacon. Yet no one could explain why David had been at the launch at night. The case would go cold. David's daughter would grow up without answers. The fishing fleet would remember him in their prayers, but stop speaking his name aloud. And for 15 years, someone in that small Maine community would carry the secret of what really happened at the boat launch that September night, until 2024, when a new detective would open an old file, when DNA technology would evolve, when someone's conscience would finally crack. The arrest would shake Prospect Harbor to its foundations because the killer wasn't a stranger, never had been. David Kelly was 53 years old when he disappeared, but those who knew him would say he'd aged a decade in the 2 years since Mary Catherine died. Lung cancer took her quick 8 weeks from diagnosis to funeral, barely enough time to say goodbye. She'd been the anchor of his life for 28 years. High school sweethearts from Ellsworth, married the summer after graduation, built a life on the rocky coast of down east Maine. They'd had one daughter, Sarah, who was 25 in 2009, living in Portland, working as a nurse at Maine Medical Center. She'd wanted to move back after her mother died, to help her father through the grief, but David wouldn't hear of it. "You got your own life to live," he'd told her. "Don't be coming back here on my account." The truth was, David had thrown himself into work after Mary Catherine's death. He'd leave the house at 4 a.m., motor out to his lobster grounds, haul traps until his back screamed, motor home after dark. The physical exhaustion helped him sleep. The routine gave structure to days that otherwise felt shapeless. The ocean, dangerous as it was, felt safer than the empty house full of memories. Prospect Harbor in 2009 was the kind of place people meant when they said real Maine. Not the Maine of tourist postcards and summer colonies, but working Maine. Salt-stained Maine. 300 year-round residents who knew each other's boats by the sound of their engines, who could predict the weather by the smell of the wind, who measured time by tides rather than clocks. The lobster industry was the lifeblood of the town. Every family was connected to it somehow. Fishing, buying, processing, supplying. It was hard work, dangerous work, but it was honest. At least, that's what people liked to believe. The truth was more complicated. Lobstering in Maine operated by its own laws, unwritten rules passed down through generations. Territory was everything. Who could set traps where? How many? What happened if someone encroached? David had inherited his territory from his father, who'd inherited it from his father. Prime spots, productive ledges, coordinates programmed into his GPS but also etched in his memory. He'd defended that territory over the years, sometimes with words, occasionally with cut trap lines, the maritime equivalent of a warning shot. But he wasn't known as a troublemaker. He kept to his grounds, respected others' territory, played by the rules everyone understood. Still, tensions existed. They always did when resources and territory were involved. The economy in 2009 was brutal. The recession had hit, diesel prices were sky high, and the price per pound for lobster had plummeted. Fishermen who'd been comfortable were suddenly struggling. Some were desperate. Desperate people sometimes did things they wouldn't normally consider. There was also the drug problem that nobody talked about publicly, but everyone knew existed. Opioids were flooding into Maine's fishing communities. Injuries were common in the industry. Crushed hands, wrenched backs, shoulders torn from hauling traps. Doctors prescribed painkillers. When prescriptions ran out, some fishermen found other sources. And where there were drugs, there was money to be made, debts to be collected, territories that meant something different than lobster grounds. David had stayed clear of all that, as far as anyone knew. He didn't even drink much, just a beer or two at the Harbor Inn on Friday nights. He'd sit at the bar, chat with the locals, maybe play a game of pool, home by 9. After Mary Catherine died, even those visits stopped. He became almost hermit-like, house to boat to house, minimal interaction beyond what business required. That's why his presence at the boat launch that night was so puzzling. September 22nd was a Tuesday. David's routine on Tuesdays was ironclad, home by 6 p.m., dinner, usually something from a can since Mary Catherine died, watch the weather, prep gear for the morning, bed by 9. He had no reason to be at the launch after dark. His boat was already moored. His truck was loaded for the morning. Unless someone called him. Unless someone asked him to come. Unless it was important enough to break his routine. The night David disappeared, 3 people remembered seeing his truck heading toward the harbor around 8 p.m. Brenda Morse, closing up the harbor store, noticed his headlights sweep across her windows. Tim Ratcliffe, smoking outside the Brass Compass bar, saw the F-150 drive past. Jennifer Young, walking her dog, recognized the sound of David's diesel engine. None of them thought it strange enough to mention until the next day, when Marcus Webb found the abandoned truck. Even then, their accounts were vague. Yes, it was David's truck. No, they couldn't see who was driving. No, there didn't appear to be anyone else in the vehicle. The time? Somewhere between 7:45 and 8:15, but nobody was exactly sure. What happened after David arrived at the launch was a complete mystery. No security cameras covered the parking area. This was small-town Maine, not Boston. No one lived close enough to see the launch clearly at night. The nearest house was a quarter-mile away, separated by trees and a rise in the landscape. The detective initially assigned to the case was Robert Hayward from the Hancock County Sheriff's Office. A competent investigator with 15 years' experience, but overwhelmed by a caseload that included everything from domestic disputes to meth labs. He processed the truck, documented the blood evidence, interviewed the obvious suspects, anyone who'd had conflicts with David, anyone who might benefit from his death. The blood in the truck was David's. DNA confirmed that quickly. But the amount suggested injury, not necessarily fatal trauma. Maybe a punch to the nose, a cut from a struggle. The keys in the ignition, door open, suggested David had exited the vehicle quickly, perhaps urgently, or been forced out. Hayward looked at David's phone records. The last call was to his daughter at 6:47 p.m., a regular check-in that lasted 4 minutes. Sarah told investigators it was normal conversation. How was her day? Reminded her to check her oil, said he loved her. No indication anything was wrong. No mention of meeting anyone. But here's what bothered Hayward. David's cell phone was missing. Not in the truck, not at his house, not on his boat. Whoever David met that night, they'd taken his phone. Or David had disposed of it himself, though why he would do that made no sense. The investigation expanded. Marine Patrol searched the waters around Prospect Harbor. Divers checked the area near the launch. Coast Guard helicopters flew grid patterns. If David had gone into the water that night, accidentally or otherwise, they should have found something. But the ocean keeps its secrets. Bodies could drift for miles, pulled by currents, eventually sinking or washing up weeks later, far from where they entered the water. The financial investigation revealed nothing suspicious. David had decent savings, owned his boat and house outright. No significant debts. His will, updated after Mary Catherine's death, left everything to Sarah. She had no financial motive. She earned good money as a nurse and would have rather had her father than any inheritance. Hayward interviewed the usual suspects in cases like this. Former crew members who'd been fired. David had only employed 2 people in the last decade. Both had solid alibis. Fishing competitors who might want David's territory. Several names came up, but none panned out. Everyone was accounted for that night, most with multiple witnesses. There was one angle that seemed promising. 3 months before his disappearance, David had been involved in an incident at the harbor. Another fisherman, Bruce Trolley, had accused David of setting traps in his territory. The argument had escalated, voices raised, chests bumped, before other fishermen separated them. Trolley had shouted something about David getting what was coming. But when Hayward pressed, witnesses said it was typical lobsterman posturing. These disputes flared up regularly, usually resolved through informal mediation by respected elders in the fleet. Trolley had been at his son's house in Bangor the night David disappeared, an hour and a half away, verified by multiple family members. As days turned into weeks with no breaks in the case, hope faded. Then, on October 10, 2009, a hiker at Schoodic Point called 911. He'd found a body washed up in a tangle of kelp and driftwood. Before we continue with what happened to David, I need to ask, are you someone who thinks about these cases long after you've heard them? Do you lie awake, wondering about the details that don't add up? Drop a comment and let me know what time you usually watch these stories. I'm genuinely curious if you're like me, diving into cold cases at 2 a.m. when the world is quiet and every shadow seems suspicious. Also, where are you watching from? Maine? Somewhere else on the coast? Landlocked and fascinated by maritime mysteries? Let me know in the comments. There's something powerful about knowing people from all over are invested in getting justice for people like David. The body at Schoodic Point was barely recognizable after 17 days in the North Atlantic. October water temperature off the Maine coast hovers around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to slow decomposition, but not prevent it. Marine life had done what marine life does. The medical examiner would need dental records to confirm what everyone already suspected. This was David Kelly. Dr. Margaret Chen from the State Medical Examiner's Office in Augusta performed the autopsy. After 3 decades of examining bodies pulled from Maine waters, she could read the ocean's effects like a textbook. Time of death was impossible to determine precisely. The cold water and post-mortem changes made the window too wide. But cause of death was clear: blunt force trauma to the skull. 2 distinct impact points, one above the left temple, another at the base of the skull. David hadn't drowned. He'd been killed, then dumped in the ocean. The wounds pattern suggested a weapon, something heavy, cylindrical. A pipe, perhaps, or a baseball bat. The angles indicated David had been struck from behind first, then again when he was down. No defensive wounds on his hands or arms. He never saw it coming, or trusted whoever was behind him. This changed everything. Not a fishing accident, not a fall from the dock, not a suicide as some had quietly suggested, given David's grief over his wife. This was homicide. Murder. Someone in their small community had killed David Kelly and thought the ocean would hide the evidence. Detective Hayward worked the case with renewed urgency, but the trail had gone cold in those 17 days. Potential witnesses had forgotten details. Any physical evidence at the launch had been washed away by rain and tides. The murder weapon could be anywhere, thrown into the ocean, buried in the woods, sitting innocently in someone's garage. The investigation pivoted to victimology. Who was David Kelly, beyond the grieving widower and dedicated fisherman? What secrets might he have kept? Everyone has something they don't advertise, especially in small towns where everyone knows everyone's business. Interviews revealed subtle layers to David's life. He'd been lending money to younger fishermen struggling with the recession. Informal loans, no paperwork, just handshake deals. Most had paid him back, but a few still owed significant amounts. There was also talk about David potentially selling his territory and retiring to Florida, where Sarah lived. In the lobstering world, that territory was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to the right buyer. Then there was the woman, Rebecca Stanton, a teacher at the local elementary school, divorced, mid-40s. She and David had been seen having coffee together a few times in the months before his death. Nothing scandalous. Two lonely people finding companionship. But Rebecca had left town abruptly 2 weeks after David's disappearance, taking a teaching position in Vermont. When tracked down, she claimed the move had been planned for months, the timing coincidental. She'd been at book club the night David died, 5 witnesses confirmed. By December 2009, 3 months after David's disappearance, the investigation had hit a wall. Hayward had a murder victim, a crime scene, presumably the boat launch, but no witnesses, no weapon, no clear motive, and no viable suspects. The case started moving down the priority list. Other crimes demanded attention. The file got thicker, but the leads got thinner. Sarah Kelly couldn't accept it. Her father was murdered, and nobody seemed to care anymore. She hired a private investigator with her savings, offered a $25,000 reward for information, appeared on local news, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. The fishing community held a benefit, raised money to increase the reward to $40,000. Still nothing. Years passed. 2010, 2011, 2012. The case went officially cold. Hayward retired in 2013. Passed the file to a younger detective who reviewed it, made some calls, but found no new angles. David's house sat empty for 2 years before Sarah finally sold it. She couldn't bear visiting, seeing his boots by the door, his coffee mug on the kitchen table, everything waiting for someone who would never come home. The Mary Catherine was sold to a young fisherman from Stonington. David's territory went with it, following the unwritten rules of succession in the lobster fleet. Life in Prospect Harbor moved on. Tourists came each summer, buying lobster rolls and trinkets, never knowing a man had been murdered at the picturesque boat launch they photographed. But small towns have long memories. People still talked about David Kelly, especially the old-timers at the Harbor Inn. Theories were traded like currency. It was drug-related. David had stumbled onto something he shouldn't have seen. It was territory-related. Someone wanted his grounds, and he wouldn't sell. It was personal. A secret relationship. A jealous rival. Something nobody suspected. The truth, when it finally emerged, would prove everyone wrong and right simultaneously. In 2018, Detective Jennifer Park transferred to the Hancock County Sheriff's Office from Portland. She'd made her reputation solving cold cases, using new investigative techniques, particularly focused on digital forensics and DNA analysis. Her first task was reviewing unsolved homicides and David Kelly's file landed on her desk. Park approached the case with fresh eyes. She noted things the original investigation had missed or dismissed. The coffee cup in David's truck, the Harbor store, only sold that particular brand of cup for 3 months in 2009. A promotional item from a local supplier. They'd kept records of who bought coffee during that period, mostly regulars whose names were handwritten in a logbook. She also focused on the missing cell phone. In 2009, phone tracking technology was limited, but the phone company still had records they'd retained. David's phone had last pinged a tower at 8:47 p.m. the night he disappeared, then went dead, either turned off or destroyed. The tower location suggested the phone was at or near the boat launch when it stopped transmitting. Park re-interviewed everyone, including some people Hayward had only spoken to briefly. She used a technique called cognitive interviewing, helping witnesses recover memories they didn't know they had. One conversation changed everything. Elderly fisherman Ernest Coombs, now 83 and in a nursing home, remembered something he'd forgotten to mention in 2009. The night David disappeared, Ernest had been working on his boat engine until late. Around 9 p.m., he'd heard voices carrying across the water from the direction of the boat launch. 2 men, he thought, though he couldn't make out words. One voice was raised, angry, then silence. He'd thought nothing of it. Fishermen argued all the time. But Ernest remembered something else. One of the voices had a distinctive laugh, sharp, barking, like a seal. He'd heard that laugh his whole life. It belonged to Roger Morse, who ran the Harbor store with his wife Brenda. Park's pulse quickened. Roger Morse had never been seriously investigated. He was a pillar of the community, 61 years old in 2009, been in Prospect Harbor his entire life. He'd given a statement saying he was home watching television with Brenda that night. She'd confirmed it. Case closed. But Park dug deeper. Roger Morse had financial problems in 2009 that weren't widely known. The Harbor store was struggling. Credit cards maxed out. 2 mortgages on the building. He'd borrowed money from various people, including, according to newly discovered records, $30,000 from David Kelly. The loan had been informal, just a check David had written and Roger had cashed. No paperwork, no terms, just one fisherman helping another. But Roger hadn't paid it back, couldn't pay it back. And David, facing his own financial pressures with the recession, had started asking for his money. Park re-examined the coffee cup from David's truck. The Harbor store's logbook showed David had bought coffee that morning, but the cup in his truck was fresh, purchased that evening. Security footage from the store's ancient system had long been erased, but the register records showed a coffee sale at 7:38 p.m. The same register showed Roger working alone that night. Brenda had left early with a migraine. The investigation accelerated. Park obtained a warrant for Roger's financial records, phone records, everything. She discovered Roger had taken out a life insurance policy on the Harbor store that would pay out if he died or became disabled. But buried in the fine print was a clause about debt forgiveness in case of creditor death. Still, it was all circumstantial. Park needed physical evidence. The original DNA testing in 2009 had been basic, confirming the blood in the truck was David's. But technology had advanced significantly. Park sent evidence to the state lab for enhanced testing, including touch DNA analysis that could pull genetic material from skin cells left on surfaces. The results were frustrating. Multiple DNA profiles on the truck's door handle, steering wheel, gear shift, expected for a vehicle the owner had used daily. Most matched David, or his daughter Sarah, who'd driven the truck occasionally. But there was one profile, just a partial, on the passenger door handle. Not enough for identification, but enough to compare if they had a suspect's DNA. Park needed Roger's DNA, but she had to be careful. If she tipped him off, evidence might disappear. She put Roger under surveillance, waiting for an opportunity to collect a discarded item. Coffee cups, cigarette butts, anything with his DNA. But Roger didn't smoke, rarely ate out, was careful about trash, almost like he knew someone might be watching. Park wondered if small-town gossip had reached him, if he knew the case had been reopened. Then, in March 2024, Roger made a mistake. If this case has you hooked, like it had me when I first discovered it, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. These stories matter. These victims deserve to have their names remembered, their cases solved. And sharing this video helps ensure that happens. Quick question. What's the weather like where you are? Is it the kind of foggy, cold morning like when David's truck was found? Or are you somewhere warm, trying to imagine Maine's brutal coast? Drop it in the comments. I love knowing these stories reach people everywhere. The mistake was mundane, the kind of thing that wouldn't matter except when you're hiding a 15-year-old murder. Roger Morse went to the dentist. Detective Park had been monitoring Roger for weeks, learning his routines, waiting for any opportunity to legally obtain his DNA. Maine law was strict about DNA collection. You needed probable cause for a warrant to compel a sample, and Park didn't have enough yet. But abandoned DNA, things people threw away or left behind, that was fair game. Roger's dental appointment was for a routine cleaning. Park waited in her car, watched him enter the office, waited the 45 minutes until he emerged. Then she badged the receptionist and explained she needed to collect evidence. The dental bib Roger had worn, the cup he'd rinsed with, the gauze with traces of blood from minor gum work, all headed to the state crime lab. The partial DNA profile from David's truck door handle wasn't much, but it was enough for comparison. 7 markers that could be analyzed. Not enough for a definitive match in court, but enough to establish probable cause for a warrant to compel a full sample. The results came back April 3rd, 2024. All 7 markers matched Roger Morse. Park brought this information to the district attorney. They had Roger's DNA on David's truck, specifically on the passenger door. Interesting because David rarely had passengers after his wife died. They had the financial motive with the unpaid $30,000 loan. They had opportunity, with Roger's alibi falling apart once they knew Brenda had left work early. They had the distinctive laugh Ernest Coombs remembered. It wasn't ironclad, but it was enough for an arrest warrant. On April 18, 2024, at 6:47 a.m., almost the exact time David would have been heading to his boat 15 years earlier, law enforcement arrived at Roger Morse's house. He was in his kitchen, coffee in hand, watching the morning news. Through the window, he saw the police cars, multiple units, detectives getting out. Brenda Morse would later tell investigators that Roger's first words were, "I knew this day would come." The arrest shocked Prospect Harbor like nothing since David's murder itself. Roger Morse wasn't some outsider, some suspicious character everyone secretly suspected. He was the man who'd extended credit when fishermen were short, who'd donated to every local fundraiser, who'd served on the school board. His family had been in Prospect Harbor for 4 generations. At the harbor store, now run by Roger's nephew, locals gathered in disbelief. The theories flew immediate and wild. Roger had been framed. The DNA evidence was contaminated. This was about something bigger, drug money or territory disputes, and Roger was a scapegoat. But others remembered things differently now. How Roger had seemed nervous in the weeks after David's disappearance. How he'd sold his own boat that winter, claiming he was too old for fishing. How he'd suddenly had money to pay off some debts in early 2010, claiming business had picked up. During the interrogation, Roger initially maintained innocence. The DNA on the truck? He'd probably touched it at some point. David came to the store daily. The loan? Yes, David had lent him money, but it was a gift, not a loan. David had never asked for it back. The night of September 22nd, home watching TV just like he'd always said. But Park had done her homework. She'd pulled credit card records showing Brenda had stopped at a pharmacy in Ellsworth at 7:15 p.m. that night for migraine medication, proving she wasn't home when Roger claimed. She had the coffee purchase at 7:38 p.m., likely when David came to the store. She had Roger's cell phone pinging towers near the boat launch at 8:52 p.m., not at his home. Confronted with the evidence, Roger's story evolved. Yes, he'd seen David that night. David had come to the store demanding his money, threatening to tell everyone Roger was a deadbeat, threatening to ruin his reputation. They'd argued. Roger suggested they discuss it somewhere private. They'd driven separately to the boat launch. But it was self-defense, Roger claimed. David had gotten aggressive, pushed him, threatened him. Roger had grabbed a tire iron from his truck, swung in panic. He hadn't meant to kill him. It was an accident. Park didn't buy it. The forensic evidence suggested David was struck from behind first, not the pattern of self-defense. And why dump the body? Why not call 911 if it was truly an accident? The truth, when it finally emerged through hours of interrogation and the evidence presentation, was simpler and sadder than any elaborate theory. Roger had called David that evening, asked him to come to the store after hours. He'd planned it for days, maybe weeks. The tire iron was already in his jacket. When David arrived for what he thought was a discussion about the loan, Roger suggested they talk at the boat launch, more private, away from any late-night customers. David had trusted him. They'd known each other for 40 years. Their kids had gone to school together. Roger had been at Mary Catherine's funeral. That trust was why David turned his back, why he never saw the first blow coming. After killing David, Roger had panicked. He'd dragged the body to his truck, driven to a bridge over tidal water 5 miles away, and dumped David into the outgoing tide. He'd thrown the tire iron in after him, then David's cell phone. He'd returned to clean David's truck of obvious blood, but couldn't clean everything. He'd left it running with the door open, hoping it would look like David had stumbled off drunk or confused. For 15 years, Roger had lived with this secret. He'd served David's daughter coffee when she came home for visits. He'd contributed to the reward fund for information about David's murder. He'd attended the memorial service on the 5-year anniversary. The news of Roger's detailed confession spread through Prospect Harbor like wildfire. The community that had been shocked by his arrest was now devastated by his guilt. How many times had they stood next to him, bought groceries from him, trusted him, while he carried this secret. Brenda Morse filed for divorce within a week. She'd been battling migraines that night, had no idea what her husband had planned or done. Their children, grown with families of their own, struggled to reconcile the father they thought they knew with the man who'd committed murder over money. Sarah Kelly flew in from Portland the day after the arrest. She stood at the boat launch, looking out at the water where her father had fished, where he'd died, where his body had drifted for over 2 weeks. She told reporters she felt relief, but not closure. Nothing could bring her father back. Nothing could undo 15 years of not knowing. The thing about solving cold cases is that it opens old wounds while answering old questions. The community had moved on, scarred but healing. Now, they had to process it all again. The harbor store struggled as customers stayed away, unable to separate the place from the crime. Some fishermen admitted they'd suspected Roger but never said anything. No proof, just feelings. And you don't destroy a man's life on feelings. The pretrial hearings revealed more details. Roger had been in deeper financial trouble than anyone knew. He owed money to multiple people, had been stealing small amounts from the store to cover personal debts. David's $30,000 wasn't just a debt. It was a symbol of Roger's failures, his pride crumbling, his identity as a successful businessman exposed as a lie. The murder wasn't really about the money. It was about shame, about a man who couldn't face his community knowing he was a failure, who chose to eliminate the most visible reminder of his debts rather than confront them. Roger's lawyer pushed for manslaughter charges, arguing it wasn't premeditated, that Roger had snapped in the moment. But the prosecution had evidence of planning. Roger had told Brenda he'd be working late that night, had made sure she left early, had brought the weapon with him. This was murder one, and they had the evidence to prove it. As the case moved toward trial, Prospect Harbor tried to heal again. The fishermen established a memorial fund in David's name, providing emergency loans to fishing families in crisis, the kind of help David had tried to give Roger. Sarah donated her father's fishing territory back to the community, letting young fishermen who couldn't afford their own grounds share the waters David had worked. The trial was set for September 2024, 15 years, almost to the day, after David Kelly was murdered. Before we get to the trial and the aftermath, let me know in the comments. Do you think 15 years is too long for justice? Can there ever really be closure after that much time? And what do you think about Roger living free in that community all those years, serving people every day while hiding this secret? Also, if you're finding value in these deep dives into cold cases, please share this video. Every share helps these stories reach more people, keeps these victims' memories alive, and maybe, just maybe, helps solve other cold cases out there. The trial of Roger Morse began September 16, 2024, in the Hancock County Superior Court in Ellsworth, Maine. The courtroom gallery was packed every day. Fishermen in their best flannel shirts, wives of the fleet, reporters from Portland and Boston, and always, in the front row, Sarah Kelly. The prosecution, led by Assistant Attorney General Martha Richmond, laid out a case built on 3 pillars: motive, the $30,000 debt; opportunity, Roger was alone at the store, had called David; and physical evidence, DNA on the truck, cell phone data, the confession. Richmond painted a picture of calculated murder. Roger had lured David to his death, struck him down like a coward, then lived among his victim's friends and family for 15 years without conscience. She showed photos of David's skull fractures, brutal evidence of the force used. This wasn't a panicked accident. This was murder. The defense, led by Portland attorney James Fitzgerald, tried to salvage what they could. Roger was a desperate man, not a killer. The recession had destroyed small businesses across Maine. The stress had broken him. Yes, he'd killed David, but it was a moment of temporary insanity brought on by financial pressure and David's threats to ruin him. Fitzgerald emphasized Roger's previously clean record, his community service, his role as a father and grandfather. One terrible decision shouldn't define a man's entire life. He asked for manslaughter, not murder. He asked for understanding, not vengeance. The witnesses told the story in pieces. Ernest Coombs, now 87, wheeled into court to testify about the laugh he'd heard that night. Forensic experts explained the DNA evidence, the cell phone tracking, the pattern of injuries. Sarah Kelly took the stand, describing her father's dedication to helping others, his grief after her mother's death, his excitement about potentially being a grandfather someday, a joy he never experienced. The most dramatic moment came when prosecutors played Roger's full confession video. The jury watched Roger describe the murder in detail, his flat affect chilling. He showed no emotion recounting how he'd struck David, how he'd watched him fall, how he'd hit him again to make sure. The gallery gasped when Roger described dumping David's body, complaining about how heavy it was, how worried he'd been about being seen. Roger took the stand in his own defense, against his lawyer's advice. Now, 76, white-haired, looking frailer than his years. He cried as he apologized to Sarah. He claimed he'd never meant for it to happen, that David had threatened to destroy his business, his reputation, his family's legacy in Prospect Harbor. He'd panicked. He'd made a terrible mistake. Under cross-examination, Richmond destroyed him. She pointed out that Roger had brought the weapon, that he'd lured David to an isolated location, that he'd struck him from behind, that he'd had 15 years to come forward, to confess, to give Sarah closure, but had chosen his freedom instead. "You served her coffee," Richmond said, voice rising. "You looked that girl in the eyes knowing you'd murdered her father, and you smiled and asked if she wanted cream. What kind of man does that?" Roger had no answer. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict. Guilty of murder in the first degree. Sarah Kelly wept. Not with joy. There was no joy in any of this, but with relief. 15 years of questions finally had answers. 15 years of wondering if her father's killer was someone she passed on the street, someone she knew, someone she trusted. Now she knew. Roger Morse was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Given his age, it was effectively a death sentence. As guards led him away, he looked back at his family one last time. His children sat in the back row, faces masks of pain and confusion. Brenda wasn't there. She'd already left Maine, starting over somewhere where the Morse name meant nothing. The aftermath rippled through Prospect Harbor for months. The harbor store closed permanently, unable to overcome the association with murder. The building stood empty, a reminder of how secrets can poison a community. Some families who'd been close to the Morses found themselves re-examining every interaction, wondering what signs they'd missed. But there was healing too. The fishing fleet came together in ways they hadn't in years. Old feuds were set aside. Territory disputes were mediated rather than escalated. David Kelly's death and the revelation of Roger's crime had reminded everyone how fragile their community was, how much they needed each other. Sarah established the David and Mary Catherine Kelly Foundation, providing scholarships for children of fishing families and emergency financial assistance for fishermen facing crisis. She wanted her father's legacy to be about helping others, not about how he died. Detective Jennifer Park received commendations for solving the cold case. She continued working other unsolved murders in Maine, using the same techniques that had finally brought justice for David. She often spoke about the case at law enforcement conferences, emphasizing how advances in DNA technology and digital forensics could breathe new life into old investigations. The case also prompted changes in how Maine fishing communities handled financial disputes. Informal lending had always been part of the culture, but David's murder showed the dangers when desperation met debt. Harbor cooperatives established formal emergency loan programs, mediated payment plans, anything to prevent another tragedy born of financial pressure and pride. 5 months after the trial, Sarah returned to Prospect Harbor one last time. She chartered a boat, went out to the waters her father had fished for 30 years. The captain, one of David's old friends, showed her the exact spots where David had set his traps, the ledges he'd worked, the territory he'd protected. As the sun set, painting the sky the brilliant oranges and purples that make Maine sunsets legendary, Sarah scattered her father's ashes in the waters he'd loved. Mary Catherine's ashes went with them. Husband and wife reunited in the only place David had ever truly called home. He should have had another 20 years, Sarah told me when I interviewed her for this story. 20 years to fish these waters, to walk his daughter down the aisle, to hold grandchildren. Roger Morse stole all of that for $30,000. $30,000. That's what my father's life was worth to him. She paused, looking out at the harbor, where it all began and ended. But Daddy wouldn't want me to be bitter. He'd want me to remember the good years, the love he shared with Mom, the way he always helped anyone who needed it. That's his real legacy. Not how he died, but how he lived. The boat launch where David was murdered has been rebuilt. A small plaque, paid for by the fishing fleet, marks the spot. In memory of David Kelly, fisherman, father, friend. The tide always returns. Every morning, as the lobster boats motor out for the day's work, they pass that plaque. Some of the older captains still tip their caps, a silent acknowledgement of one of their own who never made it home. The younger fishermen, those who never knew David, have heard the story. They know what happened here. They know why it matters. They know that in small communities like Prospect Harbor, secrets are like bodies dumped at sea. They always surface eventually. It might take days, might take years, might take decades. But the truth, like the tide, always returns. Roger Morse remains in the Maine State Prison in Warren. He's filed one appeal, denied. He spends his days in the senior unit, health failing, largely alone. His children visit occasionally, but the conversations are strained. How do you talk to a father who's a murderer? How do you reconcile the man who taught you to ride a bike with the man who killed your community's friend? Prison sources say Roger keeps to himself, reads the Bible, claims to have found God. He's written letters to Sarah Kelly, seeking forgiveness. She's never opened them. Some wounds, she says, are too deep for words to heal. The Harbor Store building was eventually bought by a young couple from away. Transplants who didn't know the history. They've turned it into an art gallery featuring local artists. Slowly, new memories are replacing old ones. But longtime residents still call it Rogers Place, and probably always will. As I finish writing this story, it's September 23rd, 2024. Exactly 15 years since Marcus Webb found David's abandoned truck. Marcus still fishes these waters, still launches his boat from the same spot. He's one of the few left from David's generation, the old guard, who remember when lobstering was simpler, when a handshake was a contract, when $30,000 wasn't worth killing for. David was a good man, Marcus told me, eyes on the horizon where sky meets sea. He deserved better than what he got, but at least now we know. At least Sarah knows. That's something. It's not enough. It's never enough when someone's taken too soon, but it's something. And sometimes, after nearly 15 years of nothing, something has to be enough. If David's story touched you, please share it. Every person who hears about these cases, who remembers these victims, helps ensure they're never forgotten. Subscribe to hear more cold case investigations, more stories of justice delayed but not denied. David Kelly was more than a murder victim. He was a fisherman who understood the rhythm of tides and seasons. A husband who loved his wife through 28 years of marriage and mourned her deeply when she was gone. A father who wanted his daughter to have a better life than he did. A friend who helped others even when he was struggling himself. He deserved to grow old on these waters, to retire someday to a house overlooking the harbor, to watch his grandchildren play on the same docks where he'd spent his life. Instead, his story ended at 53, on a dark September night, because of money and pride and choices that can never be undone. But stories don't really end, do they? They ripple outward like waves from a dropped stone. David's story continues in the scholarship recipients who can afford college because of the foundation in his name, in the emergency loans that keep fishing families afloat during hard times, in the daughter who carries his memory and his strength, in the community that learned hard lessons about trust and justice and the price of silence. The Maine coast is a hard place that breeds hard people, but it's also a place of profound beauty and deep loyalty, where communities endure because they support each other, where the ocean gives and takes in equal measure, where people like David Kelly work honest jobs and help their neighbors and deserve to come home safe every night. Justice took 15 years, but it came. That has to count for something. In a world where so many cases go unsolved forever, where so many families never get answers, David Kelly got justice. Rest in peace, David. The tide brought you home.